QSO Today episode 226, Paul Gacek W6PNG. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit, and now a new 10-watt all-band HF linear power amplifier for the ham radio builder. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth Z1UG, your host. Along with a successful career in California high-tech, Paul Gacek W6PNG became an amateur radio operator. Finding that it challenged his mind and created opportunity to learn new things, Paul discovered SOTA, or Summits on the Air, and outdoor operating. California has over 4,000 SOTA peaks, and that's a good start for W6PNG, my QSO Today. W6PNG, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Paul?
4Z1UG. Good morning, this is Paul. I am here.
Good morning, Paul. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Yeah, very much so. So I think, like a lot of people, it started many decades ago. So I grew up in London in the 1960s. And like any kid in London in the 60s, you had to sort of be aware of contemporary culture, the pop scene, a little transistor radio. I would listen to a variety of broadcast stations, BBC Radio 1, Radio Caroline, Radio Luxembourg. And during that, it gave me an opportunity to sort of tune across the dial, listen to different, what to me seemed like exotic stations emanating from different parts of Europe. And that really sort of piqued my interest. I kind of enjoyed listening to sort of different music from different places, listening to different languages. About the same time, my mother and I, and sometimes my brother, would head off to see her great uncle and her great aunt, who lived on the south coast of England. And part of the fun aspect of seeing these ancient relatives was coming home with bags full of National Geographic magazines, which at that time, for a kid who's 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, was just a fabulous sort of exposure to different parts of the world. I think National Geographic has done a wonderful job of bringing the world, into homes through photographs that are just captivating. And having pored over the magazine, looked through all of the articles, and kind of imagined places I'd like to go to, inevitably you start looking at the ads, and there would always be ads for different types of cameras, which I kind of looked at and thought kind of cool. There was always the ads for the huge American automobiles, whether it was a Cadillac, a Bel Air, or an Impala or something. Those just looked amazing to someone growing up in London. But the thing that really caught my eye was the Zenith transoceanic radio. I looked at that, kind of got a sense of the specs, and decided I had to have one of those. This was clearly going to enhance my sort of experience in the radio world. It would bring in lots of shortwave radio stations. So I talked my mother into seeing if we could go find one of these. She was convinced I convinced her that my paper route and my sort of house painting job could generate enough funds to maybe get a down payment on this. Maybe she could help me out a bit. And we duly went off to a department store in London called Peter Jones. I don't think they had the Zenith, or maybe the Zenith was just something like unobtainium. It was just too expensive. And I remember the sales guy showed us a Sony radio, which we purchased, we brought home. I still have that radio today, whatever that is. It's 50 years on. It still works. It's an amazing piece of technology. I took it home, put it into my bedroom, which was on the third floor of a huge apartment block in London. And little did I know that I was really operating from a Faraday cage. But I began to sort of learn to use the radio, sort of twiddle the dial across the broadcast bands, 49 meters, 41 meters, and began to hear different stations, and just really sort of was further captivated by the experience of hearing, not just foreign languages, because many of these stations were broadcasting in English as well, but just the sort of the romance of hearing different signals from different places, the fading, the challenge of trying to get a signal. And inevitably, there's a sort of a contest in this. I had a friend at high school at the time who had family in the States, and on one of the trips had picked up a Heathkit radio, brought it back to the UK, built it, and we decided, okay, we were going to see which of us could get the most exotic QSL cards. And so we then set two. I think each morning before morning assembly, we'd sort of discuss what we'd heard the night before, Voice of America. But inevitably, it would turn to things like sort of All India Radio, which was for us a real catch. Or I think also I have Radio Jerusalem. I still have that QSL card. And there was a humorous aspect to all of this that, you'd listen to a lot of these East European stations, Radio Moscow, Radio Prague, Radio Warsaw, and it was quite dry in terms of what they were trying to educate us with. Radio Tirana would have these updates on the 5-year plan, and with some of these QSL cards, you'd get sort of questionnaires, particularly from Radio Moscow, asking you to fill in some very interesting things like, where do you live? Do you live near coal mines? Do you live near sort of military bases? I mean, a whole bunch of stuff that seemed to have no relevance. But anyway, that was sort of my first exposure. I think we ran out of gas as the Faraday cage limited what I was really going to hear. And I think we were on the down cycle of cycle 20. So between, those plus the pressures of just being a school kid and trying to pass exams, it sort of faded after maybe a 2 or 3 year sort of experience with shortwave listening, which at the time I enjoyed immensely.
So, in other words, the interest in radio might have faded as well for quite a while?
It's interesting because you look back on your life. I mean, as we were discussing, I'm retired now, so you do tend to sometimes look back and think about different aspects of your life, but I don't think it ever faded. I think it lay dormant. I wasn't in a position to really pursue it, but I think in a way it sort of lay dormant, and maybe over time the sort of the unrealized sort of desire to pursue that got stronger and stronger and stronger until it became much more apparent to me later in life. But I wasn't actively pursuing radio for a very long time after being sort of a young teenager.
So let's not get right to the birth of your amateur radio license, but let's do some intermediate stuff here. What did you end up doing for a living? How did you how were you educated, and what did you do?
So education was pretty typical. I mean, I went to school in London. It was very usual then. I think it still is now. You pass a set of exams, O levels and A levels, and the way it's sort of set up in the UK, and it still is the case today. At 16, you kind of decide roughly which direction you want to go in. And for me, it was very obvious that it was science. I mean, I'm not a linguist. I'm not someone who was sort of could see making a living out of sort of history or something else. So science was an obvious one for me, and I really enjoyed physics and math. It was common when I was growing up to take a gap year between when you leave high school at the age of 18 and you start university. So when I left at 18, I had signed up to do physics at Newcastle University, which is in the northeast of England. It's a great engineering school, and since my time there has grown in leaps and bounds in terms of credibility. But I took a year off, and I've always enjoyed travel. I think it was that exposure to sort of exotic places through National Geographic, which did a real number on my head. Even as a teenager, I was backpacking around Europe with friends and doing stuff which I don't think parents would ever let a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid do. But my parents were pretty cool about it. And so in that gap year, I spent about 12 months living in Paris, which was an eye-opener, as first time that I was independent, away from home. And when I eventually went to Newcastle, it was clear in my mind that maybe physics wasn't really going to be a way to make money. I think I'd sort of in Paris been exposed to some of the benefits of having something more than, maybe a researcher's or a professor's pay. And talking to my tutor, he said, well, look, try physics for the first year. And if you really don't want to do it, then it's not too difficult to change. But go try this sort of new elective that we have, which is computer science. And I think I sat in, my first computer science class. And this, we have to remember is the mid 70s. So this is totally cutting edge education. I think I sat in the class for about 10 minutes, and I realized I'd found my calling. I just absolutely loved every aspect of computer science, from automata theory to compilers to databases to programming. And I did end up switching out of physics and ended up doing a degree in math and computer science. So that was, very much the formal education, which was a bachelor's degree in 1978, and graduated. And I did, sort of toy with the idea of going off and doing a PhD program. There were some great sort of research areas that were being pursued at Edinburgh University, which was an option. But once again, I think it was the pragmatic side of me that really just wanted to get into the workplace. I think a lot of us, when we're younger, in too much of a hurry, but wanted to get into the workplace, make some money. So I got, my first job down in London, and there are stories to tell about that. But let me pause and see if you have further questions.
So how did you end up in Southern California?
Well, it's very much to do with tech. The US has always been the tech center, and if you're going to participate in something, there's a lot of merit in being a part of some of the best stuff that's going on. And I ended up so sort of my first maybe we'll come on to this later, but I'll say it now. But I mean, my sort of first sort of area that I was exposed to in my early work life, I kind of had a choice. So maybe I should sort of build out this story a little bit. That having graduated from university, I ended up taking a trip, and it was a 3-month trip. It was around India in '78. I think we ended up doing about 6,000 miles on trains from the very bottom of India to the very top of India into Ladakh, which is at the time was a very difficult place to get into. It's otherwise known as Little Tibet, and it sort of reinforced this desire I had to go to different and exotic places, and the Himalayas actually is kind of played a part in some of my travels over many decades. But I came back from India. I had a real adventure, but I was definitely a little bit worse for the wear. And my first job in the UK, they wanted there was kind of two offerings. One was to go and work on a data general project. It was some kind of financial thing. It was kind of run-of-the-mill, typical kind of stuff that they had on offer. But the timing was right, and they had another project which I kind of sensed. I didn't know much about it, but it kind of sensed that it was going to go somewhere. And it was using a brand new little thing called an Intel 8080. It was a microprocessor chip. They were building a bespoke device, and I ended up joining that team. It was a wonderful exposure to embedded systems, real-time software, and one of the last pieces of work that I did on that was developing a BiSync 2780 protocol emulator. This would allow this little device to talk to a mainframe and exchange information, and using old-style acoustic couplers. And it was something that, when I started it and when I completed it, it was another of those aha moments in my life. So the first one was when I discovered that computer science was the place I really wanted to be. The next one that was in computer science, the place I wanted to be, was in data communications, data networking. I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And so that's actually ultimately how I ended up in the States, that I had developed an expertise in IBM networking. Once upon a time, IBM was a big, successful company, and they had mainframes. They had sort of client devices, terminals, and enabling or offering into the marketplace devices that were lower cost than IBM to communicate with the mainframe was a viable market, and that was one that I participated in. And I developed a lot of IBM 3270, 5250 protocol stuff, and it was intellectually challenging. It was engaging. I enjoyed it immensely. It was very new, and that ultimately brought me to California. Some friends had a small company here. They had some projects, and they sponsored me. I came over, and I guess as the saying goes, the rest is history. I just once again I kind of realized that California is a remarkable place. It has a ton to offer, but the opportunity to be a part of, to be blunt, the A team, because so much tech has been pioneered in California, was very appealing. And as I look through the sort of the 35 years that I've been in tech, it's been a journey of discovery and a journey of just sort of self-actualization, realizing things about yourself that maybe you never thought would happen. I spent 13 years as a software developer, but then for my sins, I was ejected into management and made a journey that I never thought would be possible. I ended up becoming vice president of engineering over some extremely large engineering organizations, working for companies that in the tech space were, quite legendary. I spent 5 years at Novell, which once upon a time was, the darling of the client server business. Eventually, it was dislodged by Microsoft. But I spent 5-6 years at Juniper Networks, which was, one of the success stories of Silicon Valley. I spent some time at some small startups, one which really went nowhere, but one which was in the area of cybersecurity, had a very interesting statistical analytical approach to trying to deal with fraud. And they were acquired by RSA EMC, which is where I sort of ended my career as a vice president. And, as I said, I ended up in these executive positions, much to my surprise. And so that's kind of the abridged story. It's very much around data networking, data communication, cybersecurity, internet security, which was, has been just an amazing ride. It was stimulating. It changed. In many respects, it was just very relevant. There was an opportunity to grow. There was an opportunity to mentor people. I've brought many people forward. And once again, you discover things about yourself. I would never have thought that the nuances of corporate culture, process, and values, and many other things which are non-engineering could be so critical and so interesting to practice, to learn, to teach. So that's the abridged story of my sort of 35 years in networking, and now, whatever it is, 4 years later, or sort of 4 years on, I've been retired, and love that too.
And now a message from ICOM America. As we get past the contest season and into the holidays, it's time to put an ICOM radio on your holiday wish list. So over the next few weeks, I will go into a deeper dive on the ICOM rigs that you should consider. The IC7610 is the SDR rig that every ham wants and should be on your holiday wish list. The high-performance RMDR software-defined radio has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. Did I say that the IC7610 has a direct sampling dual receivers so that you can be in two places at the same time? Work the contest on 20 meters while getting ready to pounce on 40. The IC7610 will therefore change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. What this means is that ICOM engineers have taken SDR design to new heights by loading this rig with technology that reduces phase noise, for example, while providing true SDR functionality. You have heard before that the IC7610 has dual digicell. These are RF filters designed by ICOM engineers that prevent the receiver from being swamped by large out-of-band signals when sampling in-band signals. This is ideal when strong signals are received in a contest pileup or from broadcast stations on adjacent frequencies or bands. Additional features include, but are not limited to, a beautiful touchscreen display in addition to tuning knobs and switches, a 100-watt output, built-in antenna tuner, dual receivers and dual spectrum scopes, a DVI-D connector for an external display, and an SD memory card slot for saving data. So if you're looking to have the most state-of-the-art and beautiful HF transceiver for a fair and incredible price, then check out the ICOM IC7610 at your ham radio dealer near you, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur to find out more about this amazing rig. And when you finally make that holiday purchase, tell the dealer that you heard about the ICOM IC7610 on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. You mentioned that there was a major lesson learned, or maybe a number of lessons learned from this corporate experience that you had. What do you think was the most valuable that you bring out of that and that you may be applying today?
I think there's so many. I think Maybe two things. I think it's very important to be open-minded and not judgmental. I, like a lot of people when I was younger, was sort of judgmental, and I think it's very important to listen and form an opinion based on asking questions. I think it will get us to a better place. You will learn things about the world around you. You'll learn things about yourself. So I think being open-minded and non-judgmental is an easy skill to sort of recognize and try and modify if you're not already there. I think the other one is around self-actualization, and it's maybe it's a very sort of California thing. I sometimes talk to my brother who lives in the UK and who's very English, and sort of he sort of recognizes that this is important, but maybe the English don't come to it so easily. But it's really trying to understand who you are, what makes you tick, and what do you value? How do you interact with people? Because, as I said, you can be judgmental, and you can interact with someone in a way that you're asking questions that are essentially revealing a point of view, which maybe, an invalid point of view. It may be something that you rub the other person the wrong way. So I think that self-actualization and understanding who you are is a very important thing. There's a construct which I learned and I used to teach to people, which is called the Johari window. And it's kind of like, 4 panes. And on one axis, it's about what you know about yourself. And on the other axis is what other people know about yourself. And one of those intersections is what other people know about you that you don't know about yourself. And that's very important, because that's really where you can potentially be interacting in the wrong way and not getting the results that you want. And so I used to tell people, I used to have a lot of directors and managers working in my organizations, and I used to give them lots of feedback. And I would tell them many times that this may appear to be tough feedback, but what you don't want to have happen is that you apply for a position and you discover that you don't get it. And it turns out that you met 9 out of the 10 criteria, but no one actually told you that you were failing in the 10th. And so I've done that person a disservice by not sharing that with them. So that's that pain in that Johari window, which is what I know about you that you don't know about yourself. So I think those are the two sort of in important things. And if you can indulge me for 2 minutes, I'll tell you a funny story. But if we're pressed for time, we'll keep going.
No, sure. Please go ahead.
As you can imagine, corporate America, very into training and for good cause. So later in my career, I used to get invited to, as the VP, to sort of give the opening sort of 10, 15 minutes of a training course for managers, and so kind of share my perspective about why that training course was valuable. And I used to tell people that when I was a software engineer, I was working really hard on a project, and it was remarkably one-dimensional. It was great, but it was, I'd given up everything. I mean, there was nothing else going on in my life beyond working on this project. And I thought, this is crazy. This is unsustainable. And I thought, I'm going to go down to local art school. And this is before the internet. And I think I had a brochure. They had a watercolor course, which, as a Brit, I thought, hey, this is definitely the thing I should go and try. I got down there. The class was full, and they said, sorry, it's too late for you to join or whatever. And they said, hey, why don't you go and try ceramics and pottery? And I'm like, I don't know about that. It's just not quite what I want to do. So they said, hey, go try this. And if you like it, come back, pay us to sign up for the course. If you don't, then no skin off anyone's nose. So I went down, and in the process, I'm walking to try and find the class. I'm opening these doors to different classrooms, and I open one up, and there's an easel. There's a young lady behind the easel, and she's really attractive. And I'm like, oh, hey, can you tell me where the ceramics class is? And she said, well, just kind of around the corner. I kind of said, thank you very much, and disappeared off, found the class. And there's probably about 10 people in the class. The tutor gave us like a 1 pound slab of clay, put it on the wheel, and said, put your fingers into this, put a bit of water on it, and kind of just shape it into something, and into a vessel. And I did this, and he came by and he said, oh, you've obviously done this before. And I said, no. He says, are you sure? I said, no. He said, well, you obviously got some talent here. And I thought, oh, okay. So I signed up, made lots of teapots, mugs, plates, and everything, and I did have some talent. And so the lesson there is that I was a little bit quick to judge my interests, and I was ready to dismiss this. And little did I know that I had a hidden talent there that I found quite exciting. So I would share this with the training attendees and about being open-minded and trying things. But the best part of the story is that the young lady that was behind the easel ended up marrying her. So I got not just an exposure to a new talent, I got a wife out of it.
Well, I'm so happy that shoe dropped, because I was sitting here in anticipation thinking that was the shoe that would drop. So how about that? Well, that sounds really cool. When did you finally come back to amateur radio?
So it was in the late 90s. I'd done my first sort of stint up in Silicon Valley. I found myself back in Southern California in Laguna Beach. And it actually started off with a brief sort of reacquaintance with shortwave listening. I think I had a Drake R8B, which is a fabulous receive radio. But I think I pretty quickly began to realize maybe it was because I was sort of beginning to see copies of QST that maybe ham radio was a better place to be. Maybe I was sort of operating with one hand tied behind my back. Sometime I think it was around 97, 98, I ended up sitting my my Tech Plus exam. I mean, I think there were many more license classes back in the late 90s than we have now. But I sat that, and I passed the written exam pretty quickly. And one of the VECs, kind of saw that I'd wrapped this thing up pretty quickly, and he gave me the general class exam. And at first I'm like, oh no, I'm not ready for that. And he said, go on, just try it. If you fail, it doesn't really matter. But lo and behold, I passed that. And at that time, there was the 5 words per minute requirement, and I think I had 12 months to go off and pass that. And I sat down with my straight key and some CDs and tried to learn CW, which I have to confess it does not come naturally to me. It's always been, to some degree, a big disappointment. I've wanted to be a first-class operator, but there's a part of my brain that just doesn't seem to agree with that. But I did manage to pass the 5 words per minute in an unusual way. I didn't actually manage to get whatever it was, sort of, 20 characters in a row of clean copy. I managed to pass it based on getting enough of the questions right. And part of this is because I turned up and I didn't realize that they were going to actually transmit. And I think the effective speed was 5 words, but the actual speed was 13 words per minute, which, I hadn't learned at. I had kind of made the mistake of being self-taught in that area. But I got my first license as tech. That was Kilowatt Foxtrot 6 Yankee Juliet uniform, which I thought was a complete mouthful. And once I got the general, and with the vanity system, I then applied for Whiskey 6 Papa November Golf, which is the call sign that I've kept ever since. So that was roughly around 1998.
And what was your first rig then?
So as a Tech Plus, I kind of treated myself, and I went out and bought an ICOM 746, and I actually kind of decided that I'd actually bought too much radio, and I ended up selling it to a friend of mine who was going to make better use of it, because I didn't really have HF privileges at the time. So when I did actually get to being a general class, I ended up picking up a Yaesu FT100, which doesn't have a very good reputation, or didn't have a very good reputation around harmonics and stuff. And I think it was interfering with the analog TV upstairs in the bedroom, and my wife would berate me for this. So I then migrated to an 817, and this, in the late 90s, PSK 31 was the digital rage, and I entertained myself trying to see how far I could get on 2.5 watts, which typically at the time I could make it across the States in the evening on 20 meters to, sort of W1, W2 type areas, which I kind of found exciting. And then given that we're sort of pretty much on the edge of the Pacific, I could make PSK contacts down to New Zealand and Australia, which I thought was kind of cool. So really it was the FT100 and the 817, which I kept for a long time and kind of show up later in my ham radio story.
And you were in Laguna Beach, where you are now?
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. I'm sure you know, because I think you actually grew up in California, but
Well, I graduated from Corona Del Mar High School.
Oh, okay. We're neighbors. There you go. Okay. Well, you probably actually have a better history in Laguna Beach than I do.
I'm sure it's a lot different than it was when I lived there. I haven't been to Laguna Beach for maybe 35 years, 40 years.
It has changed in some respects, but in many respects, it's very much the same. It's got a wonderful feel to it. It's got the sort of the laid back surfing aspect. It's got the sort of the Mediterranean feel with the mountains and the houses sort of heading down towards the coast, and then it's got the sort of the artist aspect to it, which makes it very different than say Huntington Beach or Newport or even Pacific Beach further south. It's a wonderful little community. It's a great place to live, and my wife and I love it immensely.
And you've been there for a long time then, right? Since the beginning.
It's I think one of the things about this negotiation with my mum about buying that first Sony radio was it was a good lesson in fiscal responsibility, and so I bought this place in the late 80s, and at the time it was a stretch, but I always subscribed to the theory that over time property is a good investment, and if you're growing in life, it can be less of a financial burden. So we've hung on to it, and it was a good move.
I would say. Now, the way that I discovered you is I actually discovered a blog that you write, and you frequently update it with the things that you're doing in amateur radio, mostly in amateur radio. Why did you start the blog, and who do you think your audience is?
So I started the blog for a number of reasons. It was sort of coincidental, or at the same time as getting into Summits on the Air, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about. But at the same time, the ARRL had an event for 2016 called National Parks on the Air, which was a fabulous event. And so it was a vehicle for me to be able to share with others sort of the fun of wilderness radio. It was a way for me to share with potentially a broader audience the sort of the beauty of it through some of the photographs. I've always enjoyed photography, and it's fun to take pictures, not just of my radios and other things, but it's fun to take pictures of the places that you're operating from. And if you do as I do, which is to hike to peaks and set up a radio station, you tend to have very good views. So I wanted to share that with people to sort of maybe encourage people to participate in this, maybe to give people a better awareness of what amateur radio really is, because I think to some extent it's somewhat misunderstood. But there's a very practical side of it, which is that SOTA is very much about trying to get to specific peaks. And there are many, many peaks that in California we have 4,500 that are qualified SOTA peaks. And it helps enormously if someone will leave a breadcrumb through a GPX trail, maybe some clues as to what to expect on the summit. Is it treeless? Has it got trees? This makes a difference in terms of potentially what gear you take. What is the distance? What's the climb like? Is it 800 feet of elevation gain? Is it 8,000? So it's helping others with a very practical side of SOTA, but it's also for myself it's a letter to me in the future. I can imagine a time when I'm sitting in an armchair with a glass of fine Scotch whiskey around a fire, and I'm sort of reminiscing with friends about do you remember, or we went to this place, and looking at the pictures and looking at the narrative. So that's some of the reasons. I think the other one also is that I think it's very important as a retiree to keep the head, keep the brain operating, and a part of that is I think writing something is good mental exercise. It keeps the recall of words there. It keeps the construct of sentences. So those are pretty much the reasons for doing the blog. And the audience is very much other ham radio people. I mean, I think over the years I've sort of done this for 3 years. I've probably had tens of thousands of views. How many? Maybe somewhere around 10,000 unique visitors. But it is hard to sort of expand the audience beyond the ham radio community, or even make much traction within the ham radio community. And I think you probably understand this better than I do. That it's a challenge because there are just so many amazing places for people to go to and get information. So I'm competing with so many others.
Oh, well, that's certainly true. There's a lot of ham radio resource. Your pictures are beautiful, and there was one that it looks like you were in the Mojave Desert in California on a mountain peak, and it looked like, the way you were dressed in the parka, that in fact you were like on Everest. So it kind of looked like the Himalayas, even though we know it was in California. So there was something about the picture that actually looked exotic. Since you're doing SOTA and you've got 4,500 mountain peaks to choose from just in California, besides the radio, what is the most essential piece of equipment that you take with you when you do a SOTA expedition to a mountaintop?
I think there's two answers. I think the trite one, which is actually very true, is your brain. I think that every SOTA expedition is a little bit different. Whether you're going up a 13,000 foot mountain. With a difficult ascent, awareness of weather. So, the brain in terms of pre-planning and using your judgment, because the thing that we love to share with newbies and was instilled in me is that the destination in SOTA is not the peak. The destination in SOTA is getting home, and it's so being smart and being mindful of the situation, the weather, so on and so forth, and whether you should abort a mission is a key part of it. But maybe what you're getting to is also just the gear, and I think first and foremost, with the thought that the real destination is getting home, tailoring the gear to the specific activation. If you're going off, for example, the picture you're referring to, I think is actually in Death Valley, and it was on Corkscrew Peak. It was cold, so don't go up that mountain. I mean, maybe nice and warm when you step out of the Jeep, but don't go up to top that mountain without some warm clothing. So being mindful of what the environment is like on the peak, from a clothing perspective, from a sustenance. If it's the summer and you're in the desert and you're going up to some high peak, it's dry. You need a lot of water. So the sort of the survival aspect of it is very important, including things like maps, not getting lost, being able to find your way home with, breadcrumbs via a GPS, having, if things go south on you, if you get stuck on a mountaintop overnight and temperatures drop, make sure that it's not the most uncomfortable experience of your life. Make sure you've got like a space blanket to try and stay warm. And a lot of this stuff doesn't have to be, super heavy. But obviously, if you're going on something that's a drive up, which, there are many SOTA peaks, there are some, not many, that are drive ups, you're going to take a different medley of gear. Early on, I really thought that there was sort of a silver bullet around, there's one station configuration that works for everything. But the reality is your gear mix, including the radio, will change depending on what you're trying to do. So in summary, it's first and foremost is having a level head doing the planning, and then survival and good radio, good radio, good antenna.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Well, Hans, G0UPL has done it again. QRP Labs announces a new 10-watt linear HF power amplifier kit for just $26 US. That's right, $26 United States currency. This power amplifier comfortably produces 10 watts from a 12-volt DC supply for every mode, including the high-duty cycle digital modes. This new linear amplifier provides 26 dB of gain from 2 to 30 MHz with a plus or minus 1 dB gain flatness over the entire range. This 10-watt HF linear power amplifier kit has no surface mount components to solder. There are a small number of transformers that need to be wound, and assembly requires care and patience. If you're a beginner, you can still do this kit. The push-pull driver stage uses two BS170 transistors in the amplifier found in the softwalk transmitter design. This final uses two IRF510 transistors in push-pull configuration. Yes, this humble low-cost MOSFET is really capable of excellent performance all the way up to 10-meter band and beyond. Hans says the short lead lengths and PCB layout are extremely important to the success of this kit. This kit includes a huge heatsink to prevent overheating even during a 100% duty cycle. Hans sent me a message that he tested key down for 1 hour at 10 watts full power with no forced air cooling. He tested again for 15 minutes at 20 watts, 100% continuous duty cycle with no forced air cooling. He even tested this new power amplifier with a 20-volt DC power supply into an open load, a shorted load, and various mismatches without instability, oscillation, or failure. So if you have a QCX or any other QRP transmitter and want to boost its output power with a highly reliable linear power amplifier at an amazing price, then click on the link in this week's show notes page to tell Hans that you heard it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO. Are you a solo summiter, or do you actually go with a friend? And do you advise going with a friend or going alone?
I think once again, it very much depends on where you're activating. So I've done many activations on my own, and there's a risk to it. To what I said, if you're level-headed and you're smart, you can minimize those risks. I mean, for example, I carry a DeLorme device called InReach, which is sort of a two-way satellite texting system, which has a lifeline button. So if things go really south on me, there's a possibility that I can raise help and be rescued. And I think that's a wise choice. My wife is very thankful that I have that. And I've been off into places on my own. One time I went marching down a trail, and it's inevitable when you end up spending so much time that you're not always super vigilant. But I heard this distinctive rattlesnake sound behind me, and I turned and I looked, and there was this humongous snake that was curled up, ready to lunge. And what was frightening to me is the fact that I had basically essentially just walked right by this thing, completely oblivious to it, and he was oblivious to me. But there's an enormous risk there, which is minimal. So going alone, sometimes you do it because it's expedient, others can't come. But I would recommend going with others because it's an opportunity for socializing. You learn a lot from other people. I've been out with many people. I was out a couple of days ago with Fred, NT5X, who's an amazingly accomplished ham radio operator from New Mexico. And, it was good to see him. Once again, I learned stuff from him. So I would recommend going with someone else. It is a safer way to go. But I've done my share of solitary ones, and it's a different experience.
Now, do you plan usually on your SOTA ventures to go and return in the same day, or do you actually make an overnight of some of them?
No, I don't really make an overnight of them, although I do actually go and do sort of a lot of camping trips. So I will take my Jeep, and sometimes if I'm on my own, I might actually go and stay in a motel and sort of make a trip out of it. So I would sort of head off into the eastern Sierras, and I would go and get 5, 6, 7 peaks. Other times I've been, with friends, and I've been camping. We've been through Utah, eastern Nevada. And the camping is just another experience. I've camped in Death Valley. I just enjoy the outdoors, but I've yet to do a sort of a SOTA activation where I've camped on the peak. I think some people do that, and maybe in the down cycle, that's the way to really experience 40 and 80 meters in a different way. But I haven't done that yet in terms of sleeping overnight on the peak.
Now, does SOTA have a scoring system? And if it does, where are you in the score?
It does have a scoring system. It's an interesting system. I know you've interviewed Richard G3 CWI, who's one of the founders of SOTA, but it's a program that started in the UK and has now spread globally. It really is great to see how it's expanding. And a lot of people are owed a lot of thanks for making that happen. But simplistically, the way it works is we have associations. So, for example, California is an association, New Mexico is an association, England is an association. So what they try to do is find a sort of a cohesive geographic entity. And there's some formula that basically look at the distribution of heights across peaks. And so the lowest qualifying SOTA peak is worth 1 point. The highest qualifying peak is worth 10 points, but it can vary. So, for example, in the UK, a 4,000-foot peak or thereabouts is worth 10 points. To get 10 points in Colorado, I think you have to get up over 13,000 feet. So there's a little bit of a difference there. So there is a scoring system, and the sort of the basic requirement here is that you have to go up a peak, you have to carry your gear in at least for the last handful of yards, which therefore does allow drive-ups and those who may not be as fit as others to participate. But you have to carry your gear in for the last part of the journey. You're required to make at least 4 contacts to get the points for the peak, and the chaser, the other guy at the other end of the QSO, gets a corresponding set of points, which incentivizes them. And the goal that many of us strive for on the activating side, which is what I am, the guy who's going out onto the mountaintop, is to become a mountain goat. And that is 1,000 activation points, which sort of simplistically would be 100 10-pointers. So that gives you an idea that this is not something that you sort of typically can knock off in a couple of weeks. I mean, for many people, this is a multi-year journey. I know many in the UK have taken many years because there just isn't easy access to as many sort of 10-pointers as we may have in California. I can drive 2 hours and I have access to a whole medley of easy 8-pointers. But that's so where am I in the standings? There's I should know this number, but I think there's maybe 2,000 or so global activators, across Europe, Australia, Japan, many new places. And I think in the States, I'm probably I think I'm 50th in the States in terms of just points. Partly because I've come to this late, partly because there are some people that are just remarkably dedicated. But it isn't meant to be a competition. It really is meant to be something where we encourage, enjoyment and personal growth. And, there are some people that have a much lower score who've activated over and over again. And, you just pursue it as you want. It really is more of an honor system, fun system.
What's the SOTA rig?
It varies. I think the 3 favorite rigs nowadays, sort of either from the Elecraft family, so that would be the KX2, KX3, of which I use both, or it could be from the Yaesu family, the 857, which is big but serves a very valuable purpose, and I've used that too. Through the 817, that's very popular, particularly in Europe and the UK, and then particularly with the CW guys, the MTR currently it's available through LNR in the States. The Mountain Topper 3 and 5 is something that people like because of its lightweight and functionality. I think it really falls into those 3 categories, and I think the truth is they all have pluses and minuses, and I think we're all right in terms of which is the best rig.
Well, you've mentioned a number of different rigs that the 857, the 817 will also do VHF and UHF. Are you doing any satellite SOTA?
No, I haven't done. Well, you can do. I haven't. I'm not sure how prevalent that is, and it's interesting actually looking at the different sort of practices. I would say that in the States we're very focused on HF, and the split is probably actually from a sort of a QSO count is probably equal between CW and single sideband. If you go over to Europe, particularly in the UK, where I've done a little bit of operating, there's a lot more interest in VHF and up. So a lot of 2 meter work, 2 meter FM, for good reasons, partly because the peaks are very popular, very crowded, but also the RSGB, the UK's equivalent of the ARRL, is, I think, doing an excellent job of promoting 2 meter and up type activities through monthly sort of activity nights and activity days and contests. And so when I was there recently, I did a couple of firsts for myself, which I was just tickled pink about. One was I used my 857 to sort of dabble with 2-meter single sideband, and I think I was running maybe about 20 watts, and I reached out from the Scottish borders down to Cornwall, and that was about 350 miles as the crow flies, across some Welsh mountains, which should have interfered with my signal. And that was pretty exciting. I mean, for a basically, 2-meter contact on single sideband. And I've heard others say that they reach even further into Europe, some even down to Switzerland from the Scottish borders, which is just amazing. But I also tried my first at 23 centimeters, which once again is sort of popular in the UK. There's a lot of microwave activity in the sort of the Scottish lowlands. It was fun to take my KX3 and my transverter and make my first 23 centimeter contact. I think it was something like 44 kilometers, and I think that's part of the fun of SOTA. It allows you to pursue so many different things in a way that is just fun.
Now, to make a SOTA contact on 23 centimeters, did you actually have to spot yourself someplace so that people would know where to point the antenna?
I'm very new to 23 centimeter operating, so I may not be the most the best source of this, but I think typically a lot of it is sort of done through schedules, and I think part of it is that people may actually start with a 2-meter single sideband or FM contact, and from that then they would try 23 centimeters or 13 centimeters. But what makes this successful is obviously having a network of listeners, and that's something which in southern Scotland there are quite a few. I was lucky enough to, when I took my UK exams, a couple of gents, one of them Pete, GM4BYF, is very much into 23 and 13 centimeter stuff, and so he and I had sort of organized this ahead of time. I knew roughly where he was, he knew where I was, and we were able to make the contact. But it's not something, because it is very directional, very limited in distance. It's not something which I think you're going to have as satisfying a time just sort of randomly looking for people. It does work, but you're not going to possibly get as much fun out of it as you could do if there's a bit of pre-thought or 2-meter, set up ahead of time. And
what's your favorite operating mode in SOTA? Are you a CW operator now?
No, I'm not. I wish I was. I've struggled with that, and I keep making different attempts to become a CW operator. But my favorite mode is very much voice. It's a very human communication, as we all know. I mean, we're talking. There's so much that you can tell about someone else, even over a crappy HF link. I mean, you can tell, an accent. You can tell maybe where they're from. You can tell the gender. That's kind of an obvious one. But you can get a sense of that person. You can get a sense of whether they're uptight, whether they're relaxed, or whatever. And so I do enjoy making voice contacts, and I get a kick out of hearing people from different parts of the world. But I do enjoy FT8, and I think that's something that we know has taken the world by storm, and it has pros and cons. I enjoy it.
I've learned more about SOTA than I have in a long time, frankly. I mean, I've talked to a number of SOTA people, but the more you learn about something, the more different questions you have. It sounds to me like you figured out how to have a good time in ham radio.
Yeah, no, I do. I think a couple of things, and so it was very fortuitous that as I was getting into SOTA, the ARRL had the National Parks on the Air event for 2016, which I just think was an amazing event. I mean, kudos to the ARRL for that. The visible face was Norm and Sean, but that was something which for me was great. I visited parts of my adopted country and was able to combine SOTA with it. But I went to so many national parks that I would possibly not have gone to for years. But I learned to manage pileups, which I don't know I really would ever have been able to do that quickly. And so that was a great event in of itself that really added to to my SOTA experience, but it actually became, a foundation for kind of where I'm sort of heading, which is obviously more SOTA. But one thing that I've really enjoyed is the whole sort of suitcase de-expeditions.
Right.
I was lucky enough to get invited to one of Chris Drummond and Bud Drummond's Buddies in the Caribbean in late 2016. I went down to St. Lucia, and that was just an eye opener. That was just amazing in terms of just the volume of contacts, the variety of call signs, and the frenetic aspect of it. And it was almost like SOTA on steroids. And I really, that really sort of grabbed me. And since then, I went on to go down to Costa Rica with Chris, actually, and a couple of others, Harold and Matt, K0 BBC. And that was very much a suitcase de-expedition. And that's an area that offers, I think, a lot of excitement, whether it be to, sort of semi-exotic entities or whether it be to IOTA. And this is kind of back to what I was saying about, be honest with yourself. I mean, I don't think I'll ever have the experience that I would be invited on, a Baker Island or a Bouvet, but there's a lot of fun to be had putting all your gear into a suitcase and hopping on a plane and assuming you've got the license, setting up shop in Costa Rica or a Caribbean island or some island, off Scotland. It's an adventure, and you get lots and lots of contacts. And, as I say, it's not that stunningly expensive to do, and you probably
and
get.
It's not nearly as risky.
No, not at all.
Like the poor guys that spent 2 years preparing for Beauvais and even circled it.
Yes, I know that was a punishment because you're confronted with your destination and then you can't even get on it.
These are great lessons. Obviously, the Drummonds do not rough it in the Caribbean, so these suitcase de-expeditions are not like dragging your junk down the beach.
No, but you're right. I mean, they've perfected the whole Buddies in the Caribbean, and they've taken many ham operators, and you tend not to get invited again because they really want to expose many people to it. But I took off. They knew about my SOTA experiences, and so I took off with Chris down to some beaches. I went with Chris onto some high peaks in St. Lucia, and we set up shop. They like to get out from the main sort of temporary QTH and enjoy that beachfront operating, particularly because vertical antennas work so well over a saltwater type environment, and that's kind of what they have. And so they're not roughing it, but it's as I say, it demonstrates the accessibility of a suitcase de-expedition, and it yields much of the fun of almost going to Bouvet.
Paul, are you a home brewer?
I am. I think, I told you earlier that, my sort of background is more physics, but I ended up in the software side of things. But I've always wanted to be an electrical engineer, and it's not one of those things that you fall into that easily. There's a fair amount of training. So it was actually one of the reasons why I was quite happy to go off and take the whole suite of UK exams from foundation to intermediate to full, because it was a wonderful way to be re-exposed to sort of electronic theory and a little bit of home building. But I've built numerous rigs and stuff over the years. I think the biggest thing I built that I'm most proud of is the K2. That was quite an undertaking. But very early on, I've built one of Dave Benson's kits, the PSK 31 20-meter warbler, which I look at today, and it's an embarrassing sort of construction on my part, but I've gotten better. I've built amps, the Hard Rock 50. Jim Veach has a wonderful line of stuff, and I've enjoyed that. But I've spent a lot of time looking at Doug Damore's books and the electronic methods for I've forgotten the name, the electronic methods for RF engineers or whatever it is. And I do teach myself. I've done a lot of sort of Manhattan construction of, oscillators, amplifiers, mixers. And I really enjoy that. I mean, that very much is one of my longer term goals is to build a radio, which most likely is going to be a single sideband radio that I've designed from scratch, I've built from scratch, and I take up a mountaintop and I operate with. I think that would be would be very cool. And I fully intend to get there at some point.
Well, that would be a cool project, and I'm sure that there's a lot of information on the internet in order to build something like that. What's the most exotic piece of test equipment you have on your bench?
Well, I kind of have spoiled myself. I have an oscilloscope. I mean, that I think is a very affordable device to have. But I've got a, and these are from Rigol. I think that's how you pronounce it. But I have an oscilloscope from them. I bought myself a signal generator, but I also, with respect to a bit of future planning, have a spectrum analyzer to, better understand the sort of the performance of filters and harmonics from oscillators and amplifiers that I build. So those are, I think, some very nice pieces to have. But I also have some other, smaller things. I mean, Aircraft has some nice gear that you can make, tone generators and so on and so forth. But I think the spectrum analyzer is by far the most exotic.
Now, your wife was a painter. Is she still a painter?
She does. She pursues a lot of painting, and that occupies a lot of her time, both here in Laguna and back in the UK. That we spend half our time in, and I've supported that. She's got a very unique style, and I'm proud of her. She's very creative, and creativity is one of those things that is not something that you can learn. You either have a creative streak or gene, or you don't.
So if I asked you what kind of impact amateur radio has had on your family life, the fact that you're married to an artist who's preoccupied might actually have some benefit.
It does. I mean, my wife's been great. I mean, she's been super supportive during my work career, where I think I spent far too much time working. But yeah, I mean, she likes to disappear off and paint. She likes to, understand the art world. I mean, she's fascinated with art and science. And so, she spends time digging into that while I'm spending time digging into different RF things. And she's been great about me disappearing off on these different trips. I'm heading out next Monday for a week to southern Utah in the Jeep with a friend, some camping, some SOTA, some hiking. And she recognizes that that's kind of what makes me tick. It's not her thing. And she's like, hey, have at it.
So you need to check out Panguitch Lake there in southern Utah then when you go.
All right. What was it? Panguitch?
Panguitch, right.
Okay.
It's just east of Cedar City.
Okay.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think, really, I think a few things. I think that the fact that so much of what we need is accessible. I mean, you can go on the internet. There's so much information you can teach yourself. There's so much sort of boutique stuff in terms of, projects that you can adopt, things that you can learn, information. So I think that accessibility makes it, really, a wonderful time to be in ham radio. I think another thing is the whole software maker side of things. As we talked a moment ago, I like building things. And I think that the maker movement, which is supported by companies like Adafruit and SparkFun, there are a lot of small things that we can acquire and use and experiment with, which are just, well documented and just very accessible. But I think, also the work that people have done around bringing the Arduino into the ham space. I think you've interviewed Glenn Popel before. I think they've done a wonderful job of promoting it. And so I think that, and maybe it's because I'm a software guy, that these things seem more accessible and more impactful. But I think the maker side is very important. But one thing that really excites me as a software guy is SDR. I think SDR is clearly, where the radio world has gone from a commercial perspective. And, it's very accessible to us. There are lots of inexpensive devices that we can acquire with, either free or inexpensive software that we can, cut our teeth on, including one which is GNU Radio. I think that's a wonderful environment to experiment in a much more detailed way with SDR. And if you couple it with boxes that you can buy from Etis or HackRF, I think there's an environment there that, particularly with Etis, that we can experiment both as receivers and transmitters. And if people are ever curious about, sort of where some people are dabbling in ham radio in kind of or not ham radio, but in RF in sort of a curious way, go look at the DEF CON website and the DEF CON YouTube stuff to do with Wireless Village. So DEF CON is something that occurs at the same time as Black Hat, and it was more to do with cybersecurity, but there's a Wireless Village side of it, and it's just bizarre in terms of what people are doing with SDR and how they're taking that space. And I think the last one is really FT8. I think that has changed the face of ham radio in a very positive way. I know some people think it's kind of the work of the devil, but I think the fact that it's made ham radio something that can be enjoyed by ham radio guys living in areas where you can't put up a big antenna is just amazing. And I'm excited about this new version that's coming out in mid-December, version 2. It offers features that will allow FT8 to be used in contests, maybe in different areas more effectively, like SOTA. So those are really the three areas.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. What is GNU Radio?
So GNU Radio is a software environment which is a little bit different than most. Maybe the best way to typify it is it's more of a visual software environment. So as you interact with it, you've got building blocks that have been pre-programmed by people. So you can have a building block that is a mixer. You can have a building block that is a sort of a tone source or a modulator. And you can essentially string them together sort of in like a flow chart. So most of us, when we think of development environments who have some software exposure, for example, through the Arduino, would think of a classic one where you're sort of looking at source code. This is at a much higher level. You don't really see the source code. So as I say, you can pick different building blocks and you can experiment. You can say, okay, I want to have an input, which is, let's say, my ETIS device, which is, being tuned to, make it up. It could be tuned to the 23 centimeter ham band. I'm going to put some filters in. I'm going to put some modulators in. And you pick these different blocks and you essentially string them together. And you ultimately, put them into some kind of output, which if it was voice, it would be maybe the computer speakers. And you can then, vary the parameters and you can get a sense of how SDR works. And if you kind of like that, you can then take it a step further. You can actually start designing your own software, either in Python, which is sort of one language that this GNU Radio is developed in, or if you're really into real-time sensitive functionality, then you can code it in C++. And there's a website. There's a GNU GNU Radio Foundation conference that's held annually in different places. There's a lot of stuff on the web, and I encourage people to go check it out. I think it's an interesting and different aspect, and it brings in a lot of sort of non-traditional ham people that we should be bringing in.
Well, it certainly gives us no lacking for things interesting in ham radio to do. What advice would you give to new or returning hams then, Paul?
I think part of it is to what we talked about earlier in terms of what were some of the lessons I learned in my corporate journey. So I think first up is look around. I think there are just so many things that we could get involved in, whether it's kit building, whether it's ARES emergency stuff, whether it's contesting. So look around. I think the second one then is really around being open-minded. But I think the important thing is also is to network, make friends, ask questions. It's almost like trying to find a job. I think that the more of a network you have, the more that you'll become exposed to, the more of a sort of a learning network, a support network you will have. So I think that's very important, whether it's through clubs, whether it's through emailing people. The responses I get contacting what are essentially complete strangers, I think are very heartwarming. I think it's very important to be realistic and honest. I think, if you're coming to ham radio late, you may find it tough to, really perform in a contest the same as someone who's been doing this for 50 years. So I think, set your expectations based on, what you're interested in, the time available, and recognize there are going to be times when you're going to get frustrated. And if you are pursuing an area that you feel passionate about, I think that'll help you muscle through those frustrations. I think, maybe sort of set it up so that you're sort of growing and rewarding yourself. It's easy maybe to go off and buy a bunch of stuff and then, wonder whether it was the right gear to get. And I think it's kind of fun to sort of make some progress and then say, okay, I kind of need this, and, acquire that, see how that evolves, and so on and so forth. So those are kind of the 5 areas that, I would pass on to a newbie.
Well, that sounds great. Paul, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been fun. And I'm sitting here writing copious notes, which will appear on your show notes page. Especially GNU Radio has my mind spinning. I've learned something new, like I do in every podcast. With that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It's been great, and keep up the good work. It's I think you have a wonderful way of sharing the ham radio experience with the greater world. So thanks.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Paul. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W6PNG in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Beep, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.